In today's video, we are going to show you guys how to make your own cab IRs. What's up everyone? If you are new to the channel, my name is Zach and this is Fuzzed. This is where we do demos of some of the heaviest sounding pedals and amps. So today we have something special planned for you. We're going to take you through the steps to make your own guitar cabinet IRs from scratch. An IR is a way to capture a particular speaker and mic arrangement in a short audio file. That file then can be used with hardware with devices such as a Captor X, software apps, or even plugins. That's going to let you dial in that cabinet sound with an amp or a modeler. IRs are a simple, cost-effective, and convenient way to dial in all types of tones without having to carry around a heavy speaker cabinet and a bunch of microphones. For today's video, we went through the process of creating IRs for two speaker cabinets. The first cabinet is going to be a open back 2x12 Sun, which is loaded with a Jensen C12K and a Eminence Texas heat. The second cabinet is going to be a closed back oversized cabinet with a Celestion G12K85 and a V30. For each of the four individual speakers, we use two microphones, a Shure SM57 as well as a AEA N22 Nova, which is a modern ribbon microphone that has excellent mid-range and top-end response, along with a bunch of low-end tone. These two microphones are John's favorite combination when close micing guitars because they complement each other just very well. Both the SM57 and N22 IRs are phased, aligned, and sample accurate, so they can be layered with two IRs to get a thick wall of sound of just nastiness. Now I'm going to turn it over to John to explain the exact process that we did to capture these impulses.
I'm John. I'm the owner of the Animal Farm in Flemington, New Jersey. Like Zach said, today we're going to take you through all the steps necessary to create your own cabinet IRs from scratch. For today, I'm going to be working on a Mac using Pro Tools Ultimate, but all of the steps that we're doing today can easily be done pretty much in any DAW and on any type of operating system. So let's get started. Alright, so to begin with, I'm going to go to Pro Tools here and I'm going to open up a new session. I'm going to label it. So 2023-09-03 ZJ for Zach. We're going to call this cabinet IR setup. Okay. Alright, I open up a new session. I'm going to open up, let's just do one track for right now, and what we're going to do is we're just going to call this signal generator. Okay. In Pro Tools there is an insert. You could even search for it using the search tool here, and we're going to type in signal generator. Now by pressing this, it's going to produce a 1 kilohertz sine wave. I'm actually going to set that over here to what's white noise. I'm just going to mute it for right now. What I like to do is I like to actually set this to minus 18 dB. All right. And I then take this track and I actually send it. So I go here to where it has my output of this track and I select new track. I go over here to mono, audio track, and I call this signal gen commit. Okay. Sometimes if I'm just doing this for myself, I'll just put SG instead of signal gen, just keep less letters and it makes it a lot easier to see if you're working in the mix mode, which you typically aren't in this kind of environment. Now what I'll do here is I'll turn this off mute. I won't hear it because this is not record enabled or input monitored. If I input monitor this, you'll hear the signal, right? Or if I press record, you'll hear it as well. I'm just gonna go in and I'm just gonna record just about a second or two because that's all you really need. Okay, and I'm gonna turn that off. I'm now gonna zoom in. Hold on. I'm gonna turn off my window scrolling. I'm gonna zoom in, and here's my white noise. All right. Now, for this to work, you only really need one sample. Ideally, you have a full spectrum white noise sound, and it's only for the length of one sample, which seems really short, but it actually works out because you're just really trying to get an instant snapshot of the frequency kind of range and sort of equalization curve and all of the other elements of that speaker. So you only need just a little blip of information. So to do that in Pro Tools, it's quite simple. We're gonna go over here and we're actually gonna change this setting from bars and beats over to samples. I like to have a sub counter, and I have that sub counter on bars and beats or minutes and seconds. It doesn't really matter, but typically is like how I like to have it set up. On my grid, I'm gonna change my grid to samples and I'm gonna set it to 1. Okay, now you'll see all these tiny little divisions and subdivisions of my timeline. I'm gonna zoom in as close as humanly possible. It doesn't really matter where you cut, but I'm just gonna take a cut. We'll just take from, say, right here. I'll cut that. Or just get rid of all this. And click this and choose commit. All right, and now this file here is just a single sample length of white noise. All right, this is what I'm going to be sending out of Pro Tools in a process known as reamping, where we basically send a line level signal out of the computer through the interface, out of the computer, and into some sort of box, either a passive or an active device that will correct for impedance and correct for any kind of volume sensitivity issues, and that will then be sent through a power amp and straight into the cabinet, bypassing any kind of amplifier. There's different schools of thought to this. Some people believe that you want your amplifier in the circuit to be as clean as possible, so some people reach for very, very clean high headroom power amps. In this context, we're going to be using a TubeWorks MOS valve, which is a pretty classic power amp that's not completely transparent. It uses MOSFETs to simulate some of the loading and sagging characteristics of a tube power amp. So at high levels, it does perform and react a bit differently than something that's a bit more kind of rigid. It also has a presence knob on it, which I actually appreciate, and I think it's actually a fun creative tool to use when creating cabinet IRs. For today on the MOS valve, we're going to leave the volume at noon, and we're going to leave the presence at noon as well. All right, so to do this in Pro Tools, what we're going to do is we're going to create a send. And on Pro Tools, I have my sends already labeled, so I have my output here. The Orion is my interface, so this is my monitor out that feeds my Dangerous ST and my monitors in my room and my headphones in the room. These hearbacks control my multi-output hearback system, which musicians in the live room use to be able to hear themselves and control their own balances. And then you'll notice down here I have my own reamp outputs. So I'm going to choose reamp output 1, which happens to be on my interface output number 21. I'm going to set my volume on that send to 0 dB, and I'm just going to choose pre-fader. Right? And now even if I wanted to, I can mute this track and it's still going to be sending that information. This mute This send happens to be pre-fader and pre-mute. So with this muted, it's still going to send that sound out of output 21. So now I'm going to show you the next steps of sending audio out of your computer interface through a reamping device into a power amp, and then from that power amp into your speaker cabinet. For this step, you don't necessarily have to have a large interface with many outputs like the Antelope Orion. You can even do this with a Focusrite Scarlett, a Motu M4, or an Ultralight. Virtually any interface that has a line level output that is separate from its monitor output. So some of the smaller Focusrite Scarletts won't work with this, but a 4i4 would, for example. So here we have all of the inputs and outputs that are coming out of and feeding into my audio interface. Anything that's on a red label here is an input and output, and we have outputs over inputs. You'll notice here I have a cable plugged into this jack here. That happens to be output 21. I'll show you where that plugs into next. So that cable going out of output 21 is now going to feed into this box here that says signal art on it. This is a reamping device. It's quite simple. If you were to open it up inside, all that's in there is a transformer that corrects for the line level impedance coming out of my audio interface to a high level guitar impedance or instrument impedance that will then feed directly into this MOS valve. So now you'll see I'm back here with this incredibly heavy 10 gauge speaker cable. One end is plugged into the output of the MOS valve. The other end will now go into my speaker cabinet on the other side of the room. So now that I've connected the speaker cable going from the MOS valve to the speaker cabinet, we're ready to send our impulse response out of the computer and into the speaker cabinet. Now, as Zach had mentioned before, we're going to be using a combination of 2 microphones to capture each speaker. We have a total of 4 speakers across 2 2x12s, which totals 8 separate cabinet IRs that we'll be providing for this video. Since I'm using 2 microphones on the same speaker, I want to make sure that they're both phase aligned. As the speaker cone is moving and vibrating and air pressure is constantly changing, we want to make sure that our capsules, in this case we have the metal element of our ribbon microphone and the moving coil inside of our SM57, that they're pretty much on the same geographic plane in front of the speaker. This prevents any kind of strange anomalies like a sudden loss of low end or a shift in the tone that sounds undesirable. So by using just kind of plain eyesight, we're going to kind of guesstimate or roughly gauge to make sure that these are as close as possible distance-wise from kind of the same rough place on the speaker. So to do that, I'm using the corner of the dust cap and cone is kind of my preferred speaker placement, and so both microphones will occupy that same space. So my 57 is directly on the corner where the dust cap and the cone meet. I'm going to do the same thing with the N22, and we're just going to kind of check to make sure that both microphones elements look pretty much equidistant from the speaker. I'd say that looks pretty good, so I think we're ready to get our N22 plugged in and get both of them plugged into mic preamps and back into Pro Tools. Alright, so now we got both of our microphones plugged in and they are on the same plane in front of the speaker cone. So they should be phase aligned in theory. Both microphones are plugged into a pair of Cappy VP28 preamps, which is a discrete transistor-based API-style microphone preamp, and both of those are feeding inputs 23 and 24 of my audio interface. So everything is set up. Just to go over our signal path once more, we're coming out of the computer through a send, feeding output 21 of my audio interface. That feeds a transformer-based reamping device, which corrects for the line level impedance that the computer is sending, and it transforms it into a high or instrument level impedance. That feeds the input on my MOS valve, which then provides all the juice necessary to power and move some speakers. The output of the MOS valve then goes into the speaker cabinet's input, and the two microphones are now placed in front of that speaker, both at the corner of the dust cap and the cone, just on opposite sides of that dust cap and equidistant from that cone. Those two channels are going into my VP28s and directly back into my interface. So I'm creating this feedback loop going out of the computer and back in. We're now ready to press record and get going. So let's just get set up in Pro Tools so that we're ready to go. We're now ready to go into Pro Tools and create the tracks that are necessary in order to record our impulse response. So in Pro Tools, we're going to hold down Command-Shift-N, and we're going to create two new mono audio tracks that are sample based. We're just going to leave the names audio for right now because we're going to rename them here. I'm going to name them G57 Texas because we're recording an Eminence Texas Heat, and G N22 Texas because we're using the N22 Nuvo to record the same speaker. Now my 57 is actually on input 24 and my N22 is actually on input 23, so I'm going to make sure that those input tracks are correct, and we'll press our record enable button. You'll see that my meters are moving because, again, I'm in the same room as this guitar cabinet. It's actually directly to my left on the opposite side of the control room, and even though I'm quite a distance away, again, I am not completely in the null of both of these microphones, so it's hearing a little bit of me talking in the room. So I'll have to be sure to be quiet and have my monitors completely off on my computer so that we're not causing any kind of issue. When doing this, I do recommend that you either wear headphones or have your monitoring set up for your computer completely off. This way you're not causing any kind of crosstalk between what's coming out of your computer monitors, your studio monitors, or your speakers, and what your microphones are picking up. What I'm now going to do is I'm going to just give myself a sample, one sample length of kind of give just before the sample actually happens, and I'm just going to press record. So now that we have our track set up and they're both record enabled, we're ready to press record. I'm going to give myself a one sample window just before the white noise bursts, just as a cushion, and we're good to go. So I'll press record and we'll hear a pop come out of the speakers, and then we'll know that we've got our sample. It doesn't need to be longer than a second or so because, again, what we're using is such a minute amount of time. We're actually going to be cutting a lot of this out. So if I zoom out, we can see here that we have this sudden spike in positive amplitude in our waveform on both channels. And if I zoom in a little bit closer, we can see that they both roughly start at the same time. I would say that these are pretty close to being sample aligned. So what we're going to do now is we're going to actually take the first kind of sign of positive amplitude and we're going to kind of cut from there and delete all of this extra stuff. We don't really need it. Okay? And pretty much from the point that we see a lack of movement, so I'm going to say somewhere around here, doesn't need to be super long, somewhere around here, we'll trim the rest of this off as well. So there's my impulse. If I play it back, you could hear what it sounds like. And they have, it's really hard to tell in this context what they're going to sound like, but they will sound a little bit different just given the differences from a Shure SM57 to an N22. The N22 is going to have significantly more low end. The N22 is going to have a little bit more of a bump at around 2.5 or 3 kilohertz. They're just going to have a different kind of tonal characteristic that I find complementary. It's really crucial when you're at this stage to be checking these waveforms to see that they're kind of moving in the same direction, right? If we saw something, for example, where this actually had a negative amplitude, for example, the waveform dipped down instead of going up, then we know we have a phase issue that we need to account for. Whether it's something in a cable, whether it's something in the microphone itself, whether it's something in our microphone preamp, perhaps a phase switch was left unchecked or pressed in and we didn't realize it. But we need to make sure that these two clips here have the same positive amplitude and same negative amplitude roughly at the same time. In this case, we're perfect. So now what we're going to do is, now that we've deleted all of this extra stuff here, we're going to consolidate this track. And we're going to consolidate the track below it. Or to consolidate tracks in Pro Tools, I'm going to hold down Shift, press Alt, and then press number 3. Not number pad 3, but the numbers up here at the top of my keyboard. Okay, so I've consolidated both of these. What I'm going to do now is just go over here, open up my clips window, right click, and then reveal it in my Finder. Here are my two impulses, G57 Texas 06 and GN22 Texas 03. What I'm now going to do is I'm just going to copy these. I'm going to take one step out of my cabinet IR setup, and I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call this Cab IR Complete. And I'm going to go into here, and I'm going to put those two files. I'm going to copy paste them into there. Now I've got them set aside from all of the other outtakes or comps that I've, or outtakes that I've possibly done, so I don't get them confused. And they're again sample aligned with no additional silence before it. When you do this step, it's really important that you delete that extra silence at the beginning of the impulse capture, because that silence here, this 100 and something samples worth of silence, will cause some issues when you go to load your impulse into either a hardware unit such as a Torpedo Captor or a Torpedo Studio, or a Strymon Iridium, or for example if I use this with a plugin such as the Lancaster Audio Pulse or the Torpedo version of their plugin, that extra silence there will actually cause significant issues. So just make sure that you delete it and that you crop your audio file to the first sign of a positive amplitude. So now I'm ready to take these two files and load them into an IR loader to see how they fare. So now let's test out the impulse responses that we made using one of Zach's DI tracks for the In the Mix for the song for this video. So I've loaded in one of our DI tracks. You could hear it here. What I'm now going to do is I'm actually going to take any kind of amp sim. For example, I'm going to use the Plugin Alliance. Let's see here. I'm going to use the Plugin Alliance BX Rocker Gain 100, which is meant to be a clone or an emulation of an Orange Rocker Verb 100. And I'm going to click past the faceplate, and I'm going to make sure that I turn off their cabinet IR or impulse kind of modeling system. So now I'm only getting what's basically the direct signal from the power amp of this amplifier. I'm just going to kind of goose it a little bit. Alright, so I have some sort of kind of high gain sound, and now what I want to do next is I'm actually going to take my Lancaster Audio Pulse and I'm going to open that up afterwards, so it's next in the signal chain. I'm going to leave on the AB option, and I'm going to go into both and choose an external IR. I'm going to go here to my folder and I'm going to choose SM57, and I'm going to choose N22 Texas. So now on my left side I have my SM57, and on my right side I have my N22. So now this is the DI guitar with an emulation or an amp modeler, and using Lancaster Audio Pulse to load my two IRs in parallel. Alright, the really cool thing with Lancaster Audio Pulse is that I can have two IRs simultaneously, and I can adjust the balance between them, as well as any kind of delay, panning, and a high and low pass if I want to necessarily sculpt some really broad stroke EQ of either impulse. I'm just going to play this section as a loop and kind of mess around with some of this balance. I should probably turn it on. Okay, let's just kind of sweep through, and you can hear both impulses. So here is the SM57. And then here is the N22. So kind of a darker, warmer sounding mic. I'm actually going to turn this pretty much, say, around like a 60-40 blend, mostly of the 57 and less of the N22. And to me, that sounds like an excellent blend of both the 57 and the N22. I get the kind of warm, low kind of character of the N22, but I still get that aggression and bite out of my 57. So now for the last step, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to record this guitar part in its entirety through the speaker cabinet just by reamping this entire track. And I'm going to compare it with a committed or printed version of the same track through the same amp modeler, but using the impulse response instead. And we'll see if we could hear any kind of difference. So here, I'm going to show you how this works. First, I'm going to actually make inactive my Lancaster Audio Pulse. I'm going to drag my reamp send down to this track and enable it. So now I should hear this guitar coming out of the computer with the rocker gain affecting it. So I will hear a distorted, what sounds like a distorted guitar going through the MOS valve into my guitar cabinet. My guitar cabinet will now record, so I'm going to actually take these two tracks here and duplicate them. I'm going to turn off anything that's on them, including the active audio track, and I'm going to bring them down here and record enable them. And so I'm going to record what's coming out of the computer onto those two tracks. So here we go. All right, so now that I've got my capture, let me just listen back to it. Okay, so that's my capture of my 57 and my N22 as it's coming out of the speaker. So now I'm going to turn off my reamp. I'm going to turn back on pulse. And I'm going to take this section and I'm going to commit it to a new track. Now it might not sound identical because my balance between the two tracks, as well as the just kind of difference in volume from the mic preamp, it might not be identical, but it should be incredibly close. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to actually create a group from these. I'm just going to call it G Texas. So I can just kind of flip back and forth between my solo mode. Okay, so XOR. And so now we can actually kind of A-B between them. I'm just going to loop this section and I'm going to play it back. So we're going to hear a slight difference in volume, but I'm just going to loop it a little bit and kind of solo between them. Let's try setting our pulse to exactly 50-50. Impulse response here, 50-50 blend between the two, and then here I have my separate mics grouped together, both set to the same amount of gain, and I'm just going to listen between them. So we can hear that they're virtually identical. There might be some small, minute differences, but most of those small differences might not necessarily translate in a very dense mix. So honestly, this is a very kind of economical and kind of fun way of kind of capturing your sound with the settings and the microphones and the miking arrangements that you typically like, being able to take it on the road with you or in the studio. So I hope you had fun watching this video, and I'll send it back to Zach.
In the mix section that you heard in the beginning of the video, we are A-Bing between the IR and the actual speaker cabinet. Were you able to hear a difference between them? Because honestly, I couldn't, John couldn't. Let me know which ones you thought were which from the video before. Could you identify the signal change from the actual speaker cabinet being recorded to an impulse response? We're now going to go back into the in the mix section on the screen. We'll reveal which ones we were changing, either if it was the real cabinet or the impulse response. See if you could tell the difference. We'll also take the drums and bass out of the mix occasionally just to solo up the guitars so you can really hear if there's a difference between the speaker or the IR. So that's the video on how to make your own cab IR. We hope everybody enjoyed it, and we hope it was a very informative video. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you hate cabinet IRs? Do you prefer them over actually miking up a speaker? Leave it in the comments section below and let's talk about it. So once again, thank you for watching, but until the next video, my name is Zach and this is